The Madison Regency Hotel stood as a glittering jewel amidst the skyline of New York City. Its grand ballroom, framed by towering columns and adorned with crystal chandeliers, was alive with elegance that evening. The occasion was a gala unlike any other, a celebration of success, wealth, and the pursuit of perfection. Inside, the elite mingled effortlessly, their designer gowns and sharp tuxedos moving like ripples through the sea of marble and glass. Champagne flutes clinked in celebration. Laughter filled the air, and a string quartet played softly in the background, creating an ambience of timeless luxury. In the heart of it all stood Ethan Carter, the man of the hour. At 38 years old, he was the epitome of the American dream, a tech billionaire whose company, Carter Technologies, had revolutionized global communication. Ethan's dark, tailored suit fit him impeccably, accentuating his tall, commanding figure. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room, sharp and discerning, while his posture exuded the effortless confidence of a man who had conquered everything, except the one thing he truly sought. Tonight was not just another celebration of his success. The media had dubbed it the Search for Mrs. Carter, a publicized event where whispers of Ethan's interest in finding a partner had turned into full-blown speculation. While he hadn't intended for the gala to become such a spectacle, he couldn't escape the narrative. Every woman in the room seemed to be vying for his attention, each dressed to perfection, armed with sharp wit and practiced charm. But for all their beauty and sophistication, Ethan felt nothing as he moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and enduring shallow conversations. His mind wandered. He had spent years navigating the high-stakes world of business, mastering the art of negotiation and manipulation. Yet, when it came to matters of the heart, he felt lost. Relationships in his life had always been transactional, whether romantic or professional. People saw his wealth, his power, his influence, but no one ever seemed to see him. The room buzzed with life, but Ethan felt disconnected. He found himself glancing at the grand double doors of the ballroom, half wishing he could slip out unnoticed. He thought of the person who wasn't here, the one who had been with him long before the fame and the fortune. Hannah Brooks. Hannah was his assistant, the one person who had always been there for him through every triumph and every failure. She wasn't like the women who surrounded him now, adorned with diamonds and draped in silk. Hannah was practical, straightforward, and impossibly kind. She had a quiet strength that grounded him, a rare ability to see beyond the facade he had built for the world. She had started working for him years ago, back when Carter Technologies was just a fledgling startup with more ambition than resources. Over time, she had become not just an indispensable part of his professional life, but his closest confidant. Ethan could still remember the first time they met. It had been in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. He had been working long hours trying to secure funding for his company, running on little sleep and too much caffeine. Hannah, then fresh out of university and eager to prove herself, had impressed him with her intelligence and calm demeanor. She had listened to his ideas, his dreams, and his frustrations without judgment, and she had offered practical solutions when he needed them most. She wasn't intimidated by his ambition or overwhelmed by his intensity. Instead, she had met him where he was, and he had never forgotten that. But Hannah wasn't here tonight. She rarely attended events like this, preferring to work behind the scenes, managing his schedule and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Ethan hadn't invited her to the gala. He hadn't even considered it. This wasn't her world, and he had always assumed she wouldn't want to be a part of it. Yet, as he stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people who barely knew him, all he could think about was her. He imagined her back at the Carter estate, probably in the kitchen or her small office, finalizing the details for his next meeting or ensuring his travel plans were seamless. Hannah had a way of anticipating his needs before he even realized them himself. She was thoughtful and precise. But more than that, she was genuine. In a world where everyone seemed to want something from him, Hannah had always been different. She didn't treat him like a billionaire or a tech mogul. To her, he was just Ethan. A voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. "Ethan, darling, "You've been terribly quiet tonight." He turned to see a woman in an elegant emerald gown, her smile practiced and polished. He recognized her as a socialite who had attended several of his events in the past. She was beautiful and poised, the kind of woman who commanded attention wherever she went. Yet, as she spoke, he found it difficult to focus on her words. His mind kept drifting back to Hannah. With a polite smile, Ethan excused himself, weaving through the crowd until he reached the edge of the ballroom. He needed air. Stepping out onto the balcony, he let the cool night breeze wash over him. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like a million tiny stars. It was beautiful, but it did little to ease the unease that had settled in his chest. For years, Ethan had built his empire with relentless determination, sacrificing personal connections along the way. He had told himself that success would bring him fulfillment, that wealth and power would make up for what he lacked in his personal life. But tonight, as he stood alone under the vast expanse of the New York skyline, he realized how wrong he had been. None of it mattered. Not the money, not the accolades, if he had no one to share it with. His thoughts returned to Hannah once more. She had always been there, quietly supporting him, never asking for anything in return. She had seen him at his worst, frustrated, exhausted, and defeated, and had never faltered in her belief in him. The idea of a life without her suddenly felt unbearable. But could he truly bridge the gap between their worlds? Could he bring someone as grounded and unpretentious as Hannah into the chaos of his high society life? And, more importantly, would she even want to be a part of it? Hannah had never shown any indication of romantic interest in him. She was always professional, always composed. Ethan had no idea if she saw him as anything more than a boss or a friend. As the night wore on, Ethan made his way back inside, though his heart wasn't in it. He endured a few more conversations, his mind elsewhere, until he finally decided he had had enough. He slipped away from the ballroom, unnoticed by most, and headed home. The Carter estate was quiet when he arrived, the grand halls dimly lit. He found himself drawn to the kitchen, where he knew Hannah often spent her evenings working. Sure enough, she was there, seated at the small table in the corner, her laptop open and a cup of tea by her side. She looked up as he entered, her expression brightening. "You're home early," she said, her tone warm but surprised. "How was the gala?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. How could he explain the emptiness he had felt, the way his thoughts had constantly returned to her? Instead, he simply said, "It was fine, but I realized I didn't want to be there." Hannah tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "Why not?" He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Because it wasn't real. None of it was." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Hannah smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "Well," she said lightly, "I'm glad you're home. You deserve a break." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he stood there, looking at her, wondering if she had any idea just how much she meant to him. He wanted to say something, to tell her everything that had been weighing on his heart, but the words wouldn't come. So, he simply nodded and sat down across from her, grateful, for now, just to be in her presence. The rest of the night passed quietly, but for Ethan, it marked the beginning of a realization he could no longer ignore. The one person he had been searching for had been beside him all along. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the towering windows of the Carter estate, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors. Ethan Carter sat in his study, surrounded by the quiet hum of a new day. The gala from the previous night felt like a distant memory, though its emptiness lingered. His mind, as it had so often lately, drifted back to Hannah Brooks, her calm voice, her sharp wit, her ability to bring order to his chaotic life. It all stood in stark contrast to the shallow, fleeting conversations he'd endured at the gala. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed. A text from Hannah appeared on the screen. "Your meeting with the board has been moved to 11 a.m. I've updated your schedule accordingly." Efficient, as always. He stared at her message for a moment longer than he should have, wondering if she ever thought about him the way he now found himself thinking about her. It was a dangerous thought, one that challenged the professional boundaries they had upheld for years. Yet, no matter how much he tried, he couldn't shake the growing realization that Hannah wasn't just his assistant. She was the one person he trusted, the one person who truly understood him. The day unfolded in its usual rhythm of meetings and phone calls. But Ethan felt restless, even as he navigated high-stakes decisions and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals. His thoughts kept circling back to Hannah. By the time the workday ended, he knew he couldn't let this uncertainty fester any longer. He needed clarity, not just about how he felt, but about how she felt, too. That evening, Ethan found himself in the kitchen once again. It was becoming a habit, these quiet moments in the heart of the house where Hannah often worked late. Sure enough, she was there, tidying up some papers and humming softly to herself. The scene was so ordinary, yet so profoundly comforting, that Ethan hesitated in the doorway, unsure how to begin. "Am I interrupting?" he asked finally, his voice softer than usual. Hannah looked up, startled for a moment before smiling. "Ethan, you're the boss. You don't interrupt." She gestured to the seat across from her. "What's on your mind?" He sat down, folding his hands on the table. For a moment, he studied her, taking in the way her brown hair framed her face and the quiet warmth in her eyes. She looked at him not as a billionaire or a public figure, but as Ethan, the man behind the empire. It was a rarity he cherished more than he cared to admit. "I've been thinking about last night," he began, his tone measured. "About the gala. About everything." She raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I realized something," he said, his voice growing more certain. "I've spent years surrounded by people who only see what they can gain from me. At that gala, I was surrounded by some of the most powerful and beautiful people in the city. And yet," he paused, searching for the right words, "none of them mattered. None of them felt real." Hannah's expression softened, though she said nothing, giving him the space to speak. "But you," he continued, his gaze locking onto hers, "you've always been real. You've always been the one person I can count on, no matter what. And I don't know if I've ever told you how much that means to me." A faint blush crept into her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. "Ethan, I'm just doing my job," she said softly. "That's what you hired me for." "It's more than that," he said firmly. "You've been more than just my assistant. Hannah, you've been my confidant, my anchor." And he hesitated, the weight of his emotions catching up with him. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Hannah looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else, something unspoken. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them charged with a tension that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. Finally, Hannah broke the silence. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "I don't know what you're trying to say, but we have boundaries for a reason. You're my boss. I'm your assistant. That's how this works." "I know," he said quickly, leaning forward, his voice urgent. "And I'm not trying to overstep, but I also can't ignore how I feel. I've been searching for something, someone who understands me. And the truth is, you've been right here all along." Hannah looked away, her hands fidgeting slightly. "Ethan, this is complicated. You're a billionaire, the face of one of the most powerful companies in the world. And I'm just me, a woman who organizes your schedule and makes sure your coffee is always hot. You're not just anything," he said firmly. "You're the person who keeps my life together. You're the one who sees me, the real me, when no one else does. That's worth more to me than anything else in the world." Hannah's breath hitched at his words, and she looked at him again, her expression conflicted. "Ethan, I don't know if this can work. Our worlds are so different. And if this doesn't work out," she trailed off. "The implication's clear." Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing lightly against hers. "I know it's a risk," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to take it, because I think we could have something real, something worth fighting for." Her eyes searched his, looking for some sign that he understood the weight of what he was asking. And for a moment, she considered what it might mean to let herself take the leap, to believe in the possibility of something more. but the fear of what could go wrong, of how much she stood to lose, held her back. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, though the disappointment in his eyes was clear. "Take all the time you need," he said, "but just know that I'm not giving up on this. On us." With that, he stood and left the kitchen, leaving Hannah alone with her thoughts. She sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat across from her, her heart heavy with the weight of a decision she wasn't sure she was ready to make. That night, as Hannah lay in bed, her mind raced. She thought about the years she had spent by Ethan's side, the countless moments they had shared. She thought about the way he had looked at her tonight, the sincerity in his voice as he told her how much she meant to him. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that he might be right, that there might be something worth fighting for between them. But even as her heart swelled with hope, doubt crept in. Could she truly step into his world? A world of endless scrutiny and high expectations? Could she risk everything they had built for the chance at something more? She didn't know. And until she did, she wasn't sure she could take the leap. For now, all she could do was wait and hope that the answer would come in time. Days passed, and though Ethan Carter went about his business as usual, he felt the growing weight of uncertainty pressing on him. He gave Hannah the space she needed, but his mind constantly drifted to her. Every interaction they had now carried an unspoken tension, an awareness of the conversation they had shared in the quiet of the kitchen. For the first time in years, Ethan, the man who always seemed in control, felt powerless. For Hannah, the decision loomed over her like a shadow. She replayed Ethan's words in her mind, his sincerity, his vulnerability. She had always admired his strength, his drive. But the Ethan who had sat across from her that night had shown her a different side, a man who longed for something real, something meaningful. And while she couldn't deny her feelings for him, the thought of crossing that line, of stepping into his world, terrified her. Late one evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows of the Carter estate, Hannah sat in her small office. Papers and schedules lay scattered across the desk, but her focus was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he had looked at her, as though she were the only person who mattered. The truth she had tried so hard to bury for years was now impossible to ignore. She cared for him deeply. She always had. With a deep breath, she stood and made her way to the library, where she knew Ethan often worked late. The massive oak doors were slightly ajar, and she paused, peeking inside. He was seated at the large desk, his head bowed over a stack of documents. A single lamp illuminated the room, casting a soft glow that made him look almost vulnerable. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face him. But then, as though sensing her presence, he looked up. "Hannah," he said, his voice warm but laced with surprise. "Is everything okay?" She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Ethan set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about what you said about us, about the possibility of more." His eyes softened, but he didn't interrupt, letting her speak. "You're right," she continued. "You've always been there for me, too. And as much as I've tried to convince myself otherwise, I can't deny how I feel about you." She paused, her voice faltering. "But I'm scared, Ethan. Scared of what this could mean. Scared of what I might lose if it doesn't work." He stood then, moving around the desk to stand in front of her. "Hannah," he said gently, his voice firm but reassuring. "I know it's a risk. I know our lives are different, and I know it won't be easy. But I also know that I don't want to go through life without you. You mean more to me than anyone ever has. And I'll do whatever it takes to make this work." She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't belong in your world, Ethan. I've spent years in the background, making sure everything in your life runs smoothly. I don't know how to be anything more." "You don't have to change who you are," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I don't want you to fit into my world. I want us to build our own, together." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, the fear that had gripped her began to loosen. She realized that he wasn't asking her to become someone else. He wasn't asking her to leave behind the life she had built. He was asking her to trust him, to take a chance on something that could be extraordinary. Slowly, she nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's try." A smile broke across Ethan's face, and he stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his. "You won't regret this," he said softly. "I promise." In that moment, the tension between them melted away, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. For the first time, they allowed themselves to embrace what had been growing between them for years. Ethan leaned down, his forehead resting gently against hers. "Thank you," he murmured, "for trusting me." Their first kiss was soft, tentative, and filled with the promise of what was to come. It wasn't the grand, sweeping moment of a romance novel, but something far more intimate. Two people finding their way to each other after years of quietly longing. It was real, and that was all that mattered. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance as Ethan and Hannah navigated the new dynamic between them. They kept their relationship private at first, unsure how the outside world and the business would react. But within the walls of the Carter estate, they allowed themselves to explore what it meant to be together. They talked late into the night, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and doubts. And with each passing day, their bond grew stronger. Ethan, who had always been so focused on his career, began to see the world through a different lens. Hannah's influence softened him, grounding him in a way he hadn't thought possible. For her part, Hannah found herself stepping into the light, realizing that she didn't have to stay in the background. With Ethan by her side, she began to see her own worth, not just as his assistant, but as his partner. Eventually, the time came to make their relationship public. It wasn't easy. There were whispers and speculation, questions about whether Hannah was good enough for someone like Ethan. But they faced it together, their united front silencing even the harshest critics. Ethan made it clear to everyone, from the boardroom to the press, that Hannah was the woman he had chosen, and he wouldn't let anyone diminish what they had. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of the Carter estate, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Ethan turned to Hannah, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I used to think that success was about power, about building something that would last forever. But now I realize that none of it means anything without you." Hannah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You've always had everything you needed to succeed." "Ethan," she said gently, "you just needed someone to remind you of what really matters." He kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "You've done more than remind me. You've given me something I didn't even know I was looking for." As they sat there, wrapped in each other's presence, they knew that their journey was only just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. For in each other, they had found not just love, but the kind of connection that made everything else worthwhile. And for Ethan Carter, that was the greatest success of all.